Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our panel on Equality Shakespeare. You'll notice that we have a panelist missing. Anya Lumba has been held up. I'm hoping that she can join us before the end of the panel. But I'm so grateful that we have so many esteemed guests with us today. And so I'll just begin with a brief context for this panel. Equality Shakespeare, or EQUALS for short, is an initiative that I'm setting up with Dr. Yasmin Arshad, who is today's session co-host, and she's an honorary research fellow at University College London. EQUALS will sit within the Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance and will, we hope, become a regular series of events and other initiatives devoted to exploring and advocating for equality through Shakespeare across fields, disciplines, and media. We hope to break down borders in traditionally isolated fields by encouraging discussions across subjects, specialisms, and approaches. And it's a huge honor to celebrate this launch with our esteemed guests. We have with us today speakers who are true pioneers in their respective fields in more ways than I have time to describe here, and their work, their projects, their publications are field-defining and game-changing in so many ways. We have Wendy Lennon, who is a doctoral candidate at the Shakespeare Institute and founder and director of Shakespeare Race and Pedagogy, which launched incredibly successfully in February of this year. Hopefully, before the end of this session, we'll also have Professor Anya Lumba, Catherine Bryson Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. We have with us Professor Valerie Trube, Adrian Rich Distinguished University Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan, and Professor Catherine Shapp Williams, Lecturer at the Department of English at the University of Toronto. So to save time for our discussions, I'll refer you to their incredibly rich biographies, which you can see attached to the SBBA events website, as well as their own online profiles. And I believe Yasmin wants to kick us off with the first question.
Thanks, Chris. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this panel today. I wanted to begin, if I may, by asking you each to tell us briefly what drew you to your areas of research interest and whether your particular areas of inquiry do have a role in helping us create a more equal society. If I may start with Valerie, and then we'll go to Catherine and Wendy, that would be great.
Thanks, Yasmin, and thanks again for inviting me to participate. I'm so happy to be here. I began working on gender and sexuality as an undergraduate in the 1970s, where I wrote an honors thesis on a mid-20th century Canadian lesbian novelist named Jane Rule, who wrote popular fiction that had been important to me in my own earlier life. And as a young lesbian working before queer studies kind of hit the scene, I certainly felt excitement about and an obligation to promote and analyze literature that represented same-sex desire. I had a lot of optimism about that project and what it might do for contemporary gender and sexuality norms. And then as a graduate student, I fell in love with Shakespeare, kind of very unexpectedly, and started to write essays that became my dissertation, 2 chapters of which were on cross-dressing in the comedies and homoerotic desire. And it seemed obvious in the 1980s that cultural changes regarding gay and lesbian identity could bring new questions and even new life to Shakespeare's texts. And in particular, a lot of us at the time were intent on promoting thinking beyond gender binaries and thinking beyond homophobia. So I still believe that that promise is there, but I've learned that cultural change tends not to take the form of linear progress. And that globally, as well as in the US where I live, we remain in a period of intense cultural conflict around matters of gender and sexuality, as well as race and disability.
Catherine, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. And thank you to Yasmin and Chris for organizing this panel. It's really exciting to be here with all of you. So I became really interested in questions of disability when I was a graduate student working on early modern drama. I knew that I was a Shakespeare person. I was intensely interested in questions of the theater. That also broadened, I feel I should say, to think much more about drama by Shakespeare's contemporaries as well. And a friend who was a disability rights organizer had suggested that I begin thinking about critical disability studies. And so as I began to read, I found the theoretical insights from disability studies absolutely transformative. Thinking about, for example, the social model of disability and the basic distinction between impairment and disability. So a distinction between a body and the world that disables that body. So the example that we often use is the idea that a wheelchair user is not disabled until she gets to a building that doesn't have a ramp. And that key insight that the source of disability is not within the body itself, it's in how we have arranged the world, how the world is built to enable some bodies and disable others. And as I began to think with the critical revisions and extensions of the social model of disability, to think about how actually every aspect of culture, it's not just physical environments, but every aspect of culture is structured by normative ideas about bodies and minds, and began to sort of think about what that means for the literature and the theater that we encounter. And Shakespeare's Richard III was a key example in much of the early work in disability studies, looking back to this idea that disability, that early modern disability was primarily a metaphor for moral evil. And I wanted to complicate that idea. So my dissertation and then the book that has just finally come out of that is about actually thinking about how beyond a model of deficit or metaphor or moral interpretation, we can actually think about disability as a form of human diversity and disability identity as a site of aesthetic innovation. So the theater finds in disability a way to experiment with the body of the actor. So that piece became really important for me. And then I'll just say, in terms of the idea of how our inquiry creates a more equal society, one thing that has been really important for me is actually shifting from the language of equality to equity and disability justice, which is about building access and thinking about how we create access and how we challenge structures of power that have understood disability as automatically disqualifying. So trying to think instead about how it is that we value disability as a facet of human diversity, precisely because of that unruly resistance to the norms that have shaped our world, even when we may not perceive them.
It's fascinating. Wendy, would you like to tell us about your work?
Thank you. Yes, thank you to Chris and Yasmin as well, and the other panelists. Your work is just fantastic. Thank you for having me. So my academic research and my education initiative began with through my curiosity and my love of literature. I was searching to understand and piece together my own heritage and the connections between the Caribbean and England, migration and empire. So inevitably, I found myself exploring history and historical contexts and how those influence literature and art. I'm fascinated by the links between the past and the present as well, and how what we can analyse in early modern literature actually still connects today. So ultimately, I believe that literature can teach us so much about ourselves and has the ability to foster empathy, which is especially important for today, because I think it's Empathy Day today. So by being open to learning and understanding the past and having empathy allows allows us to create a more equal society, I believe. So all of that curiosity and reading led me to a fellowship with the brilliant Nandini Das, and she really opened my eyes to ways of reading the text that I hadn't encountered before, and actually identifying race in the plays and examining how to kind of develop that racial literacy, which then turned into my academic research. So yeah, that's how I kind of began, and how I feel that Shakespeare can teach us more about ourselves.
Your areas of research interest, each of you, are so inspiring, and I really hope that it inspires future young scholars to pursue these fields and expand and open them up even more. Thank you.
I totally agree. And I think your responses have just answered the brilliant question in the chat about how do we affect cultural change and sustain it. And I think, you know, this idea of equity, justice, and also making sure that we're enabling the world to enable everyone. And I think that's a really important idea. For our individual questions, I'd like to come to you first, Wendy, if I may. Kind of beginning from the school level up, because I know you're a wonderful and award-winning teacher. As a school teacher who is very concerned about the curriculum, from your experience, how do we navigate conversations around race in the classroom and on the examination page? And how might we use Shakespeare to do this effectively?
I think sometimes using Shakespeare can be seen as a negative thing, but I think and consider the possibilities of using Shakespeare as a tool as opposed to a weapon. When weaponized, Shakespeare becomes a symbol of class division, racial exclusion, social hierarchies, cultural capital, even the perpetuation of literary and linguistic colonization, even with the exams you mentioned and exam papers, how that can kind of destroy the plays, and they should be alive. So for me, Shakespeare and how I use it is a tool to build and create and empower. The learning and teaching of Shakespeare becomes an exciting opportunity to reconsider curriculums, challenge language, develop literacy and racial literacy. And I think that will ultimately improve uptake at higher education, because I think it's really important to engage students when they are at school, because otherwise we won't have those undergraduate and postgraduate students. I think there's wider engagement within and outside the education system with the chance to embrace storytelling. And for me, that's the most exciting part of Shakespeare. So applied this way, Shakespeare can actively and effectively revitalise the curriculum. To effectively navigate conversations around race, teachers must be educated so that they feel equipped and have the racial literacy required to create a safe environment to discuss these topics. And I think that training and preparation is really important. Through my work, I've recently asked an exam board to reconsider the list of critics and criticism for their A-level course to provide schools the more inclusive list of Shakespearean scholars to widen and diversify the field. I feel that exam boards also have a responsibility to consider the questions that they're asking and the themes of their courses as well. So as opposed to actively avoiding or silencing race, especially for a play such as Othello, I think that's a really key A-level text. They must have the courage to allow students to engage with those conversations. I mentioned history earlier, and I feel strongly that all exam boards should include AO3 context and history within their Shakespeare courses, because that gives us an opportunity to consider the past, including the language and construction of identities in the early modern period, and how that can connect to us today.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And what you say about storytelling is also so important, isn't it? And that has been a kind of running theme throughout so many of these events is, you know, how do we choose to tell those stories? It's so important, the language we use, and how can we tell them more inclusively? Thank you so much for that really thoughtful response. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Yasmin.
Yes, how we tell the stories is so important, isn't it? Catherine, if I may turn to you next, I wanted to ask, in your article, Demonstrable Disability, published in the journal Early Theatre, you explored the use of keywords such as lame and monstrous as negative descriptors. You explained that this was undertaken, and I'm slightly paraphrasing you here, as a provocation to take stock of the curious tendency of disability rhetoric on the early modern stage to not describe bodies of actual character, but rather to index a free-floating set of social attitudes. Why is it important to think about the kind of language we are using today when describing Shakespeare's characters?
Thank you. So I think that the work of thinking about rhetoric functions in a couple of exciting ways as we think about Shakespeare's plays. So first, it's the matter of excavating the early modern specific rhetoric for bodily difference, right? So whether those are key terms like deformed or deformity, which again, we think about with Richard III, or terms like monstrous as a sort of early modern specific term that is often used to think about bodily difference. So I think part of the task of early modern disability studies is excavating that vocabulary in order to make sense of what it's doing in its particular moment. And then also to think about how those early modern legacies still shape about how we think about disability today. So it's both sort of taking stock of historical difference and also thinking about what gets illuminated when we return to these early modern texts through the critical paradigms of our present moment. And I think that when we're thinking about the theater, it's also, of course, complicated because we are thinking both about the discursive, about the language that is used to describe bodies and characters on the stage, and the presentational, right? The work of the body of the actor that is inevitably changing how we think about how that language is working in the theater. So one exciting element, I think, when we're thinking about language we use today, one exciting thing is actually to think about what is happening in terms of Shakespeare performance and disabled actors or disabled theater makers, which I think goes to the point about conversation, because it also becomes a question of who is setting the terms for the conversation into which the Shakespeare text is intervening. So there is a long history in Shakespearean acting of what we call cripping up. And that term, crip, is a term that is revalued through disability activism. It was a slur. It becomes sort of reimagined as a site of resistance to the normative. But that also in theater terms has meant critiquing how quite often able-bodied actors have been cast to play disabled characters because bodies if we want to think in terms of the body-mind, a really contemporary term that we use to sort of think about the wholeness of the person, because disability has been understood to over-signify on the stage. So part of what's exciting about our moment of both Shakespearean performance and adaptations or reimaginings of Shakespeare's plays. I'm thinking of Mike Liu's Teenage Dick, which rewrites the character of Richard Gloucester around Greg Muscala, an actor who has CP, and thinks about how the actor and the character, how disability experience brings those figures together. So it's an exciting moment to both think about how we talk about early modern disability and to think about how it is that we use insights into disability to transform what we expect of Shakespearean acting today.
Can you tell us a little bit more? I mean, that's fascinating, and it sort of highlights the power of rhetoric and how even that feeds into our views today. In your introduction, you spoke a little bit about how disability studies emerged from the Disability Rights Campaign. Could you expand on that a little bit more, if possible?
Sure. So one of the key slogans of the disability rights movement was "Nothing about us without us." And that was the disability rights movement. It has taken slightly different shapes in different contexts, of course, and has taken different shapes in response to, going back to that question in the chat, to the legal ramifications, right, that were required to create access in society. But that idea, nothing about us without us, is, I think, also one of the key drivers of disability studies as an academic field, which has always tried to attend both to literary and theatrical, to the kinds of representations of disability that we might expect, but also to attend to them without assuming, for example, that disability is a metaphor, whether that is a metaphor for who a character is supposed to be, or whether, and this is David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's early work on narrative prosthesis, which sort of said, stories, plots use disability to individuate a character, and then they revert to an idea of sort of curing at the end, or of getting rid of disability. So the ways that we have thought about disability in a society in which we have understood disability only as deficit, only as negative, not as an aspect of identity to prize in really exciting ways, those attitudes have shaped how we read text. So part of the rereading of texts and the rethinking of Shakespeare's plays has been about actually asking us to center the voices of disabled theater makers, and to think about the concept of disability that we understand quite differently when it comes out of lived experience. And that's what I see a play like Lou's Teenage Dick doing. So that reimagining the part of Richard Gloucester, that rewriting that happened in conversation with first Greg Muscala, who was the actor who premiered the role in the New York production, and then Lou actually rewrote chunks of the role for Daniel Monks, who premiered the role at the Donmar. And who is hemiplegic. So that's an amazing example, and it's fruitful for Shakespeare scholars, because of course we know Shakespeare wrote for particular actors, and traces of the actor can remain in the role. So that's a way in which we see in this very contemporary example actually something that lets us theorize both disability and the theater differently.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That's really great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed. Yeah, what you're saying about lived experience is so important. You know, also, how can we hear from more voices who have experienced that as a lived experience? You know, someone myself who spent 15 years being a primary carer for somebody with very severe disabilities. You just see the world completely differently, but you also see ability in the kind of totally new way. You don't just look at somebody and think disability, you look at ability in a completely new way. So I think there's a way, in terms of the way we need to train ourselves to perceive things differently. And I think that does take the sharing of stories, again, to pick up on a comment in the chat that's just been posted about, you know, how we tell stories about ourselves is key. Shakespeare can empower us in a positive and sensitive and nuanced way to tell our stories. That's a great quote in the chat. That through these means we can educate each other. Thank you so much. Valerie, I'd like to ask you about something in your book, Thinking Sex with the Early Moderns, and you explore there the intersections between history, literary criticism, and queer theory. And you state, I want to shift the critical conversation from disciplinary boundaries to the less reified notion of academic field formations. Queer theory, after all, is not a discipline. Indeed, it has a strong anti-disciplinary bias. What opportunities do you feel we as scholars and teachers have today for breaking down such disciplinary boundaries? And why do you feel it's important to do that? Does thinking about sexuality through Shakespeare help with this endeavor?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, I think that everything we've been talking about thus far invites us to challenge disciplinary boundaries. I think that the kinds of questions that we're bringing to Shakespeare today cannot be answered strictly through a literary critical lens, nor need they be. And so I would say more broadly that it's the questions that one brings to literature that direct one towards particular fields, disciplines, methods. I've always loved literature. You know, I was a bookworm as a kid. I've always loved literature. I love literary criticism, which I thought was amazing in its kind of ability to kind of get deep into a text and help me see things I hadn't seen as a more passive reader. But I've also always been interested, as other people on this panel have been as well, in both history and contemporary social issues. So the question is, how do you bring all of that together? And for me, crossing disciplinary boundaries has been something I've both done instinctively. I was a double major as an undergraduate in women's studies and in American studies. So I was thinking about politics and literature and music and art all together. And history, but there's particularities about the way that some disciplines interact that also have drawn my attention. And in the book that you mentioned, Chris, Thinking Sex with the Early Moderns, what I was trying to work through is how it felt affectively for me to be residing intellectually at the intersection of history with its own disciplinary preoccupations and protocols, literary criticisms with its own, and queer theory with its own. And in particular, queer theory and history have been long at loggerheads with each other around ideas about what it means to think about time and change. So I was wanting to kind of just sit with that feeling of disjunction and discomfort between the disciplines. Because often when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we act as though it's both desirable and easy. And the fact is, doing it is really hard, because if you do it well, you're really taking seriously the disciplinarity of another discipline, and you're figuring out how you stand vis-a-vis that. So negotiating the tensions between different presuppositions and methods has kind of long been a touchstone of my work. And in some ways, I've moved from thinking strictly about literature. I never wrote strictly about literature, but focusing mainly on literature, to focusing on method. And I think that that has been kind of a touchstone of my academic career, to ask, why do we think the way we think, and is this the best method for us to use? Because a lot of the go-to methods that circulate are just picked up. They're learned in graduate school often, and then you learn to apply them without necessarily thinking about whether other methods might be more appropriate for the questions that you have. So I've been wanting to kind of bring into the field of Shakespeare studies in particular, early modern literary studies as well. What does it mean to think about method? And in particular, methods in the history of sexuality and in theories about sexuality. I will also just say that history and theory also are often at a kind of loggerheads, just in terms of how they think about embodiment, for instance, the importance of material conditions, or the relationship between a kind of universalizing perspective that theory brings to the more historically contingent and specific perspective that historicism brings. And we all kind of work our way through this conundrum, I think. Those of us who have been taught to think historically, those of us who have been taught to ask theoretical questions of the kind that Catherine in particular was just talking about. Because, and by universalizing, I mean these questions about embodiment, disability, ability, they apply to everybody, right? And that's their universalizing focus, and yet, or potential, and yet they have particular impacts on particular people that are disproportionate. The same is true for race. I would say that we're all racialized, but for some of us, that is a privilege, that translates into privilege. And for others, it translates into disadvantage or lack of access. So trying to put all of this together, I guess, is where I've landed most recently in my career. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, oh, that's fantastic. I do want to sort of pick up on one point that you mentioned, that, so I hope this isn't a curveball question, about embodiment. I teach a course called Shakespeare's Bodies of Knowledge, and I should say both your work, Valerie and Catherine, is set reading on that module, not just suggested, but set reading. I have examples of your work that students have to read for that module. And one of those is an article you wrote, Valerie, about the creation of norms, in a sense, what is a norm body in King Lear. Amazing article, very interdisciplinary, with fantastic work on anatomy. And so I did just want to get your sense of then how might the difficult and challenging road of mixing these disciplines get us to challenge what we think of as norms, particularly in that kind of context of embodiment.
Yeah, well, thanks for the shout out for my and Catherine's work. That's great. Well, let me just back up and say that article on King Lear, called The Nature of Norms, is part of a long-term, over 20-year now project that I've been working on, called Mapping Normality in the Early Modern West, that looks at anatomy books, illustrations, cartographic representations of the world's people, particularly on world and country maps. So it's an effort to bring together my longstanding interest in gender and sexuality with race and actually normativity writ large. So it's very influenced by disability studies and the discourses of normativity that have come to the fore through disability studies. But it was also influenced early on by Foucault and by the sense that thinking in terms of norms is itself, the normativity and even normality is a historical construct that we can date. I was not satisfied with Foucault's own historicization of that. And going back to the medieval period and the early modern period, we can see a language of norms, which originally meant right angles or rectitude, in late medieval and early modern texts. So I'm interested in historicizing the notion of norms. And
just seeing Anya come in. Sorry to interrupt you. Just in
Anya,
I'll come to you in a second. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'll wrap up really quickly.
No, carry on, Valerie.
Just that the nature of norms is something that is changing, but that, as Catherine was saying, the past is a kind of resource for us, a use for us, both in its alterity, in its different from us, and in its similarity or in its legacies that carry on. So I'll leave it there.
That's fantastic. And I'm so looking forward to that book. And that is a beautiful article. And both your new books will be on my modules list for sure. And thank you so much. And thank you so much, Anya, for joining us. It's fantastic.
I'm so sorry. I don't know how the timing got confused at my end. I'm really sorry. I'm
sure it's my fault for mixing up the
10 o'clock our time.
Yeah, so yeah, that's my fault for mixing up what GMT was. So thank you so much indeed for joining us. We'd love to get your perspective on why you're passionate about the subject that you're working on, and do you feel it can create a more equal society?
Well, hopefully it can. I mean, what I work on in the early modern period is the long legacies of race and colonialism. And I think what we are seeing in our own time is both explosion of divisive ideologies all over the world, but also movements that question them. So the question for all of us is, where do we fit in? Where do we fit in to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the anti-caste movements, to the movements battling Islamophobia, anti-immigration movements, the consolidation of national borders and cultural borders that I do think we are seeing around us. And it's kind of frightening, because when you go back to the early modern period and you see how these things were evolving then, and I will not say beginning, because the idea of getting to origins is sort of not the point. I do think that by studying these things, by teaching these things, and by articulating our differences, confusing, ongoing discussions about this, we can really contribute to understanding both the long legacies of this and combat the silos. I lived in 3 different countries, and in each country, people have a particular take on difference, and they insist that theirs is the only take. But governments everywhere, institutions everywhere are so committed to keeping those things going that it is our business to connect with people battling this. And I think we can do it both within our field and by creating conversations between different fields. So yeah, definitely, I think race is probably going to be the big division of our time, in the next, decade, if not more. So definitely.
Wow, that's why these conversations are so important. Absolutely. And I believe, Yasmin, you had a question also for Anya.
Anya. Anya, in your book, Shakespeare, Race and Colonialism, in the chapter on Antony and Cleopatra, you write, and I quote, "By showing us how identities which we call ethnic or cultural or racial are fluid and yet not, for that reason easy to manipulate, Antony and Cleopatra captures the contradiction that lies at the heart of race." Can you talk a little bit about how early modern conceptions of race in Shakespeare help us understand our own responses to issues of ethnic and racial identity today?
Yes, absolutely. I think, race has been dismantled as an ideology in terms of the theories behind it, in terms of scholarship. So everyone pays lip service to the fact that there's no there. But we know racism is there and it's increasing all the time. So how do we understand this contradiction? And I think the only way we can do that is when we understand that racial ideologies themselves and racial practices based on them are not fixed. They do recur over time. They're remarkably tenacious. But in order to be tenacious, they change the form they take. They change the address they make to people. Sometimes they marshal skin color. Sometimes they marshal culture. In all my work, I've tried to suggest that culture and biology are, after all, products of that racial history, ideas about what culture is and what biology is. So rather than taking them at face value, we need to see in a particular moment how past histories are being marshaled, but also something new is being added. And in the case of Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare goes back to a long history of talking about Black people as well as about Muslims in a way. Cleopatra is not exactly a Muslim, but at the time that he was writing the play, Egypt was Ottoman territory. So all these things are coming into it, and sexuality, of course, is at the heart of it. So these are protean discourses, which doesn't mean they're benign, but in order to see how they are tenacious, I think sometimes in Shakespeare's play, you get a sense of this multiple changing vocabulary. And I think it's extremely useful to then use that to contest the idea that there is a fixity, a hierarchy about race. Is color more important than religion, or is this more important? And I think that is where I'm seeing everywhere in the world, each society sets up its own ideas of how we are really either the most racist or the least racist. And teaching Shakespeare in these three different contexts has taught me to adapt what I'm saying to the audience, that is, to the students, particularly who are listening to me. And I think that kind of plurality in the vocabularies of race, the shiftingness, but also the tenacity, is what we can get from reading some of these early modern plays. Not just Shakespeare, though, not just Shakespeare, but Shakespeare in tandem with other writers, often the neglected writers.
Thank you so much indeed. That's absolutely. And we've got. I think. Let's go for just a couple more minutes longer. I'd like to give the last word to Wendy, if I may. I believe you had a question, Yasmin, for Wendy.
Yes, Wendy, it was more of a personal question. As a young girl growing up in England, the daughter of South Asian immigrants, the situation of women in Shakespeare, issues of race, foreignness, and national identity resonated with me on a personal level. I was wondering if you could tell us how Shakespeare has helped you with your identity, and how can he help us learn about ourselves and others? Thanks.
Thank you so much. The plays resonated with me too, and that idea of understanding that longer history of racial tensions and the language around race as well has helped me to understand some of the things that I encountered growing up, and some of those challenges and the tensions even as a mixed race woman. I think my kind of curiosity has led me to find a sense of belonging throughout our discussion. That has been fascinating. Thank you so much. Those terms such as dissatisfaction, discomfort, disjunction, that plurality, finding teachers and other scholars who understand that and explore those things have given me a sense of belonging. So that search to understand those tensions within myself, and my heritage from my Jamaican mother, that's really helped me have a sense of belonging, which is so important. And how that migration from the Windrush, my grandmother and my mother coming to England, there's actually a much longer history of migration that I didn't know about. But it has taken me actively searching and finding out, and it's been fascinating. And that searching has allowed me to understand other people and read about their stories and understand different ways of reading Shakespeare. I do think it's important, though, that as a woman of colour and for people of colour, it is limiting in a way and reductive to simplify us and our experience to the colour of our skin. I think we are complex human beings after all. So it is also, our human experiences that connect us to Shakespeare's plays. So, for example, when I was in year 8 and I was grieving the loss of my father, then I kind of understood Hamlet at that point in my life. When I studied King Lear at A-level and I connected with Cordelia's plight to navigate her parents' fractured mind, then that sense of belonging was as important as my academic success. So I think that we can create kind of more equal society if we understand those stories and connections, and how that can create a sense of belonging.
Thanks.
That's a beautiful note to end on, isn't it? Thank you so much. I wish we had another 2 hours to discuss this, and there will be more conversations, more discussions coming up. So thank you. I'm so glad you were able to join us, and apologies for going slightly over time. But this is such an important discussion. I wanted to carry on the conversation a bit longer, and the conversation will continue. This is only the first of many events, we hope. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Yasmin, for wonderfully co-chairing this, and thank you everybody for watching. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.